Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Just as we've endeavored to manage this public health crisis, we are managing our state budget on the basis of data, informed projections, and fact, not politics. So I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about where we are fiscally today and what we might anticipate going forward. As governor, along with my budget office, and like every governor and budget office across this country, we're continually monitoring this dynamic and rapidly evolving situation. Montana differs when it comes to our state budget from most other states. Our state finances were in a historically strong position heading into this pandemic. And because of that, we also believe we'll come out of this in a stronger financial position than most states. We entered into fiscal year 2020, which went from June of last year until the end of this June, with an unobligated general fund balance of just over $360 million. That's money in the bank beyond the anticipated government spending for that period. Moreover, coming out of the 2017 legislative session, and for the first time in our state's history, it was created a budget stabilization reserve fund. So the $360 million general fund balance we enjoyed last spring allowed us to transfer $57 million into this reserve fund, filling it to the maximum allowed under state law, which is $117 million. So in addition to the healthy general fund balance heading into this biennium, I could access approximately $92 million in budget stabilization reserve to offset any loss of revenues. All of that could be done without cutting any government services. Additionally, during my first legislative session as governor, we created a fire fund to pay for the expenses of Montana's wildfire seasons. Our fire fund is presently at $55 million, putting us in a strong position heading in to this year's wildfire season. We were able to nearly double our fire fund at the end of last fiscal year because of conservative management by our state agencies, which finished the fiscal year under budget. So that allowed for a $30 million transfer into the wildfire suppression fund last year. Now, last legislative session, I did receive some criticism from legislators for vetoing bills that would have spent more or collected less revenues. During the State of the State address in January of 2019, I implored our legislature to act in a fiscally responsible manner. I'd stated then that the difference between reserving $300 million instead of $200 million is one bad fire season, or 1.3% error in revenue estimating over the next 2.5 years. It's the impact of things that we can't control, like government shutdowns and trade wars, market volatility, and investor anxiety. A $300 million reserve, one that's accessible, not requiring us to decimate government services before the funds become available, safeguards us from those factors beyond our control and from repeating past mistakes of eliminating services that our fellow Montanans rely upon. That's what I had said in January of 2019. Well, I don't think anyone in the legislature, or certainly anyone listening in today, could have anticipated a global pandemic at the time. I am glad that we did insist upon leaving that extra money in the bank, because the unexpected has come our way. We're not immune to the widespread economic issues states in every corner of this country are facing. And while our economy is more diversified than some of our neighboring states, we also have to recognize that Montana has a more than average dependence on tourism, hospitality, and service industries. And revenue declines are just starting to materialize. Yet, because of our strong fiscal management leading up to this crisis, we are better prepared and in a stronger financial position than most other states in the country. Leaving the money in the bank is allowing us the time to gauge and understand the economic impacts of COVID-19 that are occurring in every corner of our nation. It's allowing us to preserve and maintain key essential services in the short and the midterm. Our general fund cash flow is manageable. While I recognize that projections are just that, and we will know more after income tax collections at the end of next month, right now, my budget office is projecting that we will still have $113 million in general fund reserves on June 30th of next year. And that isn't even tapping into the additional $92 million that would be available to access in the Budget Stabilization Reserve. I recognize that a lot can change in the months ahead. I'm buoyed by the fact that unemployment insurance claims are already down 20,000 per week from where they were at our highest point, which was about a month ago. I'm optimistic that we are responsibly opening up our economy at a rate faster than most states while still being protective of public health. I think there are still a lot of unknowns, including the fact that the president and the vice president both said to the nation's governors that they recognize that you can't have a rebounding economy if you're gutting essential state and local government services. So Congress may well step in the months ahead. And there are Democratic, Republican, and bipartisan proposals, even right now, to do just that. We'll handle the budget just like we've handled our response to COVID-19, based on science and data and by responsibly handling the day-to-day changes. We won't handle it based on politics. We're not in a position to have to make unnecessary across-the-board cuts to essential services, ones that Montanans are relying on more than ever during this pandemic. We are taking steps at the state level to save on future expenditures, offset revenue reductions, and avoid a future that would lead to drastic cuts. We certainly have reason to be optimistic about the shape of our state budget amid a global pandemic. The next point that we'll see more information to help us further analyze the budget picture will be when income tax revenues are received in July. We'll continue to demonstrate conservative fiscal management throughout this pandemic and until my last day serving as governor. And at the same time, we continue to work every day to see that Montana's economy is able to rebound quickly and effectively. We'll continue to provide financial support where it's needed most now, including with the emergency grants for Montana small business owners and other individuals impacted by this crisis. And we'll continue to pursue every avenue available toward a short and a long-term economic recovery. In other news, the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park announced in a press conference earlier today that they intend to do a partial day-use only opening in parts of the park starting next week. I've been in conversations with the superintendent of Yellowstone, the governor of Wyoming, business and community members, as well as local health departments in Gallatin and Park counties. And our state's chief medical officer has been working with Gallatin and Park counties as to what steps we believe would need to be taken to feel some level of comfort that we could mitigate the risks of a park opening. Well, there have been a lot of discussions and learned of the park's final decision to open next Monday some gates. Learned that yesterday afternoon. I, like every Montanan and every Montana family that relies on visitors to Montana for their economic livelihoods, want to see the park reopened. Yet I also know that because Montanans have done this right, because we took aggressive measures and because Montanans took seriously those measures, we have the lowest hospitalizations and cases per population in the nation. We want to keep it that way. And while our economy certainly relies upon and we appreciate our visitors, we also want to ensure that those visitors don't bring problems, meaning their infections, from their home states to our state. And when they do, we want to make sure that Montana is prepared. As such, even as the Wyoming gates to Yellowstone will open next Monday, in conjunction with conversations with Yellowstone National Park, the Wyoming governor, Park, and Gallatin counties, I've determined that the entrances on the Montana side of the park will not reopen until June 1st at the earliest. Just as our businesses need time in preparing their reopening plans, so too do our county health offices in the gateway communities to bring online increased surveillance testing of workers and park staff, capacity for quarantine and isolating, staffing to interface with business and the public, and to support expected response needs. This June reopening date, it's dependent on our continued monitoring of new cases in Montana, in line with increasing our test capacity throughout the state. We aren't even 2 weeks into our restaurants, bars, and breweries reopening, and we want to make sure all these reopenings to date won't significantly set us back. We also want to make sure that enhanced mitigation measures the park is committed to are put in place, including health screening protocols, a surveillance testing plan, the limiting of large gatherings, and frequent cleaning and sanitation requirements. And frankly, it'll benefit the park's efforts if they can work out some of the wrinkles of reopening with fewer visitors to the park than would be the case if all gates were open. Appreciate that in a letter to me received last evening from the park superintendent, that he stated that he does not see any circumstances in which the park can consider simultaneously opening or reopening of all 5 entrances. Also, it's important to recognize that the decision to open the gates of Yellowstone impact more than just Gallatin and Park counties. Positively and negatively, that decision impacts communities across our state. Once the stations at Gardner and West Yellowstone open, and especially because the park is opening for day use only at this point, and limited use, no overnight services, I recognize this creates concerns regarding the 14-day out-of-state travel quarantine and its effect. As a result, in the upcoming days and weeks, we'll be working with many of these communities' elected officials, businesses, and health departments to monitor the travel quarantine and figure out an appropriate path forward. In addition to the gateway communities around Yellowstone, we want to make sure that other communities that are accustomed to an influx of out-of-state tourists are prepared for what might be coming. So in summation, working with Yellowstone National Park, our gateway communities, and local public health, we've concluded that the Montana entrances to Yellowstone National Park will reopen no earlier than June 1st. During this interim, in addition to monitoring what the impacts of our phase 1 openings might have on our state, we'll be working with communities and tourist-dependent business sectors to determine when and how we can most safely start welcoming out-of-state visitors. We'll now open up for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can press 5*. You'll be notified that your hand is raised. When we unmute your phone, you'll be notified that you've been called on to ask your question. So the first phone question, please.
Hi, Governor Bullock. This is Marisa George here with NBC Montana. I'm wondering if you could give us an update on the increased testing goals that you've talked about now for a few weeks, and if there's any update on antibody testing, and also if phase 2 is starting to come up in conversation with your team.
Thanks, Maritza. So the question was update on testing, including antibody testing and discussions of phase 2. So I'm relatively confident now that we have the testing supplies that will certainly be necessary. This week we received 19,500 swabs, 9,000 viral transport medium from the federal government to continue testing symptomatic Montanans, ramp up testing of those in vulnerable Montanans in nursing homes and assisted living facilities and in tribal communities. We have a commitment from the federal government to continue receiving a continuous supply chain. We've also just about got in place a contract with a reference laboratory that could also take up to 1,500 tests a day from Montana and process them within about a 2-day period. Nursing home was tested on a trial run last week. This week, testing supplies are being distributed to 22 nursing home facilities across our state to perform the testing. We've been working with the Fort Belknap Nation. This Friday and Saturday, Fort Belknap will be conducting enhanced surveillance testing. It's drive-through testing, and that's supported by the Montana National Guard. When it comes to antibody testing, there's still some concerns, frankly, about sort of their overall viability, and I think that the FDA has just approved 1 or 2. We'll continue to monitor that along the way. The questions of phase 2 and when we will get there, certainly we're a week and a half into opening up our restaurants, bars, and casinos. We want to still make sure what's happening there, as well as with your first question, we're ramping up testing. So we haven't made any definitive decisions on when we'll get to phase 2 quite yet. Hi, Mike.
As you said, we don't really know what it's going to look like in the state budget for maybe 6 months at least, or a few months. But 6 months from now, we have huge unemployment, lots of businesses still locked down, tourism hurt. Isn't it a fair assumption that there is going to be a deficit going into the next biennium? And if that's the case, why shouldn't the government be making some spending cuts to prepare?
Well, what we do is, 6 months from now will be almost the start of the next legislative session as well, a year apart. What we do all the time is both carefully manage the dollars that we have and also, to the extent that cuts became necessary, that were triggered, we certainly would. Montana is in a place where an enviable position, frankly, compared to most states right now. And the notion that then what we should do is cuts based on what might happen 6 months from now or a year from now, I think it's probably misplaced for a number of reasons. One of which is adding to the unemployment rolls doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense, or cutting services that Montanans rely upon doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense right now either. And what we'll do is continue to manage both the projections and what's happening to make those determinations. Question on the phone.
Hey, Jonathan, this is Holly. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Holly. How about you?
It's going. I wonder, and I don't know if Director Livers is there, but this might be better aimed at him, but without those tax details that we'll start to get in July and on from there, what is this projection of $113 million in the general fund reserves? What's that based on? And then, is there a way to sort of say, those projections, revenue projections, how are they lining up to what HJ2 looked like from 2019?
Go ahead, Director.
Sure, thanks, Holly. The starting point for projections is information we've got from our market analysis firm and others who are doing analysis across the country. Most of those are done on a nationwide basis, and so Montana's information is interpolated from that. we try to add a little more customization to it to adjust for Montana-specific considerations, including the fact that we're in an earlier reopening position than originally anticipated, but also taking into account some of the things we're seeing coming out of the federal government, including some increased FMAP consideration and also the ability to be able to ultimately offload much of our response costs to the CARES Act. So that's essentially forming the basis from it. I think you had a second part of the question that I... HJ2. At this point, I think we expect to be relatively close to HJ2 for the current fiscal year. There could be some drop, and then likely in the second year of the biennium, starting July 1st, we do expect to see some additional, undoubtedly some significant revenue fall off. Again, the strong position going in, though, gives us considerable cushion as we start to see the impacts of the pandemic.
Great.
Go ahead.
Next phone question.
Hi, Governor. This is Phil.
Hi, Phil.
Hey, I noticed that you were saying that budget office and state agents taking steps to save on expenditures and offset revenue reductions. I mean, are there any examples, anything what they're doing in terms of the steps that you said they're taking?
Yeah, and first and foremost, and that's how we even had like a $30 million plus reversion, I think, last year, that first and foremost, we always try to challenge expenses, make sure that those expenses are warranted. Even through this, we've said that take a look at what the hiring is. Don't necessarily fill all vacant positions, and we continue to work with the agencies on a regular basis to make sure that they're spending Montana's taxpayers' dollars wisely. Next phone question.
Hi, Governor. This is Nikki Bullock from Yellowstone Public Radio. Thanks so much for holding this press call today. You all just mentioned that some of the state's response costs can be offloaded to the CARES Act, and I'm wondering if you have a number attached to that. And also, Mr. Lively just mentioned that you are expecting some significant revenue fall off, and again, do you have kind of a range of what that might look like, a dollar amount range, please?
Yeah, so Nikki, the first question is, as far as using some of the state dollars or the CARES Act dollars for state expenses directly related to COVID-19. Do we have an estimate of what that is right now? No, we don't. But we're working on that, just like we'll be working with MACO and the League of Cities and Towns for their direct COVID-19 response costs, that in sort of the next wave of CARES Act dollars, we'll end up working with them to both reimburse the local governments for their direct expenses as well as the state dollars. But we don't have the estimates of that put together yet. And as you might imagine, that this continues to be an evolving and dynamic situation. To the second question, the exact revenue drop-offs of what we might anticipate, that too, I mean, we do our best projections, and that's how we get that even under things that we would end up with still leaving the money in the budget stabilization reserve and looking to next June 30th of still north of $100 million in an ending fund balance. But I think Montana, like every other state, we just have to see how this all continues to unwind before we can put specific dollar amounts to what might be happening a year or more into the future. Next phone question.
Hi there, Eric Fisher from Montana Free Press. Hope you're doing well. So, continuing with budget questions, there's a fiscal report out from the Legislative Fiscal Division yesterday that cites a stress test done by Moody's, which says Montana could see a $400 million overhead, I believe, in fiscal 2021. the same trend here we're talking about here. That sounds, I wanted to ask first, have you seen that, or Director Livers has seen that? And two, it sounds like that's more pessimistic than what you're looking at, so I was
Do you want to
curious
start? Go ahead.
about why.
I'll start with Director Livers, then I'll answer some too, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for the question. Yeah, we have seen both the LFD report and Moody's stress test. That's one of the inputs that we've started with. But where I think we differ from that is, I think that's only taking a look at the revenue side, and we're well aware of some additional inputs on the budget side, both from a standpoint of expense management by the executive, but again, some additional revenue that will be realized as a result of federal action in terms of the increased FMAP percentage and offloading funds to the CARES Act.
Yeah, and I'd only add, Eric, you'd asked if I was familiar with it. Actually had a phone call with the nation's governors and the author of that report as well. It does, it looks at it at a much higher level, not actually digging into what both each state's doing and what some things might happen. I mean, some of the assumptions of it are that it was about a month ago and that state economies would completely be shut down over the next couple of months is one of the areas that they said. And so some base projections or discussions of that as they look at a higher level than sort of the specifics on the ground. Look, it's all concerning, right? That we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And every state has concerns about fiscally what's going to be happening at their state, just like every business has those concerns along the way. And what we'll continue to do is closely manage that along the way, given the best information that we have.
Governor, there's a lot of rural counties in the state that have had 0 cases. I'm wondering if there's any consideration to perhaps accelerating lifting of restrictions in those counties or lifting them entirely in those counties.
Well, I think we'll continue because we've also seen rural counties being most hardest hit. And there's even, where often the testing is done doesn't necessarily reflect everything that happened. So, look, I'm pleased that we were reopening our economy at a rate faster than most states, but we were also doing it by science and public health. So we'll continue to monitor what things are along the way. There are different challenges, is but one example. When the Valley County, this was several weeks ago, the Valley County, someone with a hospital said, yeah, we only have 1 or 2 ventilators. So that an impact of a number of cases in a rural area would be no less significant in taxing the resources than an urban area. Next phone question.
Yes, Governor. Stacey Elliott from the Dillon Tribune. Where does the situation with the infrastructure bonds you actually bought earlier this year fit into how this is all played out? And have you heard anything about Glacier?
You want to do infrastructure bonds, Director Liver? Have not had conversations with Superintendent Mao as of the last, and that's the head of Glacier, the last at least week or so. They are typically, just because of the amount of snowfall, a bit further behind. Nonetheless, I think I read something that they're not even looking at having any discussions till June 15th. When it comes to the infrastructure bonds and that work, I'll turn it over to Director Livers.
Sure, thanks for the question. So you may recall that we were on track to sell infrastructure bonds last November. We had a significant disagreement with the legislative auditor, which prevented us from moving forward on that. We were delayed until we were able to produce and clear the 2019 consolidated annual financial report, and moved as quickly as we could after that to go to the bond market. That was in early March, I think March 11th, I believe. And at that time, the market was overly volatile. We were ultimately not able to sell and chose to withdraw. and we're able to circle back. We've monitored the market situation, and we're able to go out a couple weeks later and sell infrastructure bonds at an historically low rate. So those projects are still being designed, readied for the spring construction season. As soon as we are able to proceed safely with construction, some of them are already being realized on the ground, but they're ready to go. Thank you.
Next phone question.
Good afternoon, Governor Chris Peter. I was wondering if you'd seen the letter from the West Glacier businesses and if you had any reaction to that.
Chris, I have not seen that letter yet. Next question.
Hey, Governor, this is Holly again. You had said earlier that you were part of discussions with a bunch of stakeholders about monitoring compliance with the travel quarantine and figuring out an appropriate path forward there in regards to sort of the phased in reopening of Yellowstone. What's in those discussions, and how, I guess, what sort of monitoring is in place for that, and what are you talking about with people in terms of if you find people aren't following the quarantine?
Holly, what I had said, well, maybe repeat the question, if you don't mind. I might have missed part of that.
Yeah, sorry, I sort of just trying to understand what monitoring for compliance with the travel quarantine looks like. And then, if we're finding that people aren't complying, what is in place to deal with people who might not be following that rule? And then I guess there's any discussion about if that can continue, how long that 14-day quarantine will stay in place going forward.
Sure. So as far as what sort of monitoring and what's being done with the current 14-day travel quarantine for out-of-state travelers here for non-business related purposes, we do have reader boards coming into Montana. We have National Guard informing people and temp checking people coming off of the airlines and our train stations, and many local jurisdictions have signage up in their areas as well, reminding folks of that. As far as what it means for Yellowstone, I think that's one of the things that we have to take a look at. And that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that not only those communities, but communities all across the state, and we want to look at the data along the way when they might be prepared for lifting that. I know that I've said at this point before that there's no better place to be than Montana in the summer, and I know a lot of people want to be there. But we also want to ensure that they're not just importing their problems, or in any of the reopenings. I've said time and time again, I think that Montanans can expect that we are going to get positive cases, but it's how we deal with those positive cases and whether we have the infrastructure in place to mitigate any further spread. Next question.
Hi, Governor. This is Jonathan Hedger from Montana Free Press. I was just wondering if you kind of could outline what those benchmarks are that must be that must be met for Yellowstone to reopen. You kind of said at least June 1st, but what does that mean?
So Jonathan, we have actually been working with both the Park Service and local public health. We want to make sure, as some examples, we want to make sure that we have enhanced testing capacity and opportunities, not just for Park Service employees, but also for the greater surveillance side of this in Park and Gallatin counties in the gateway communities. They've been working on it. We want to make sure that the protocols are in place in case one needs to isolate or quarantine individuals. We also want to make sure that, and that's one of the things that I think that, as the superintendent said, it wouldn't have been wise to necessarily open up all 5 gates at the same time. This affords Yellowstone the opportunity to see what happens when you have a couple of gates open. So we're continuing to both, and local public health officials in Park and Gallatin County have also been speaking to their counterparts in Wyoming just to make sure that this is done right and the base infrastructure is there in the event we do have additional positives. Final phone question.
Hi, Governor. This is Kevin Trevlin from Yellowstone Public Radio. Thanks for taking this call. You mentioned the Fire Reserve Fund earlier. Could you see some of that $55 million being put towards something other than firefighting this season? And what would it take for the state to dip into that pool of money?
So Kevin, the question was $55 million in the Fire Reserve. Could you see it being used for other things? What would it take to actually dip into that money? You know, I think that we are in a position fiscally where we wouldn't have to make that determination to even try to take from the Fire Reserve. As I noted earlier that, you know, there's another $92 million even in the Budget Stabilization Reserve, and that's in addition to money that we had in the Indian Fund balance. And I think it's wise to make sure that we keep money in the Fire Fund. You know, the $55 million could cover about 2 of our average fire seasons, but the worst one that we had just to state dollars alone 2 years ago was upwards about $70 million. So it's wise to have that money there. As far as what it would take to take money out of that, I think that would have to be a legislative change. Yeah. Any last questions? Great. Well, thank you all so very much.